I'm Andy Grogan-Kaler. I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. In this section of the course, I'm going to be talking about key concepts in research. We're going to start by talking about measurement. How do you go about interviewing study participants to get some ideas about the behavior or the phenomena that you're interested in? The place that I start to talk about this is to talk about what I call the philosophical problem of measurement. Most of the time in social work research, we are assessing participants in our study through the use of questionnaires. Sometimes we're using direct observation, but most often we're asking people to comment on their own behavior or on somebody else's behavior or their own attitudes, thoughts and feelings, or somebody else's attitudes, thoughts and feelings through a questionnaire. We are trying to get at usually some kind of inner mental world. We're very concerned about attitudes and beliefs and things like psychological well-being and psychological distress, but we often don't have a direct measure. Again, we're relying on these interviews and questionnaires and observations. So we have this philosophical issue of how does what we measure relate to what we actually hope that we're studying. One of the ways that I have thought to start talking about this is, since we do use questionnaires so often, is to imagine what we've called the bad questionnaire, and this with my colleagues at the Performance Measurement Institute at the William Davidson Institute here on campus. This bad questionnaire is an example that we have used. Now, usually we're talking about social development projects in different countries around the world. So when we do this workshop, we use this questionnaire, which is supposed to be or hypothetically addressed to farmers in small fields. And so we can imagine a number of different questions. What is the highest level of schooling your father received? And the response categories are primary, secondary, post-secondary. Now, the problem with this set of questions is that it's not a comprehensive set of response options. There may be other categories. For example, we haven't asked participants whether they don't know how much schooling their father received, whether they refuse to answer, or whether there's some other level of schooling that we don't have on the questionnaire. So we haven't made sure that these categories are appropriate. Our second question that we ask of these hypothetical farmers in this example that we give is, do you think that fertilizer increases crop yield and quantity? This is what we call a double-barreled question. The problem with this kind of double-barreled question is that we're asking about two things potentially unrelated. We're asking about crop yield and we're asking about quality. And people who are responding to the questionnaire don't know how to answer the question as a result. Also, we have response categories of yes and no. It may be better to use some kind of scale of responses. So do you disagree? Do you strongly agree? Are you neutral? Rather than simply asking yes or no, we might try to get some more sense of the variation in people's response to this question on the questionnaire. Third question, you wouldn't divert water from your neighbor's farm to help yours, would you? This is what we call a leading question. It's quite clear from the way we phrased this question that we think diverting water from a neighbor's farm is a bad idea. So anybody we ask a leading question is already going to know what we think is the good answer, the socially desirable answer, and what we think is a bad answer, or the socially undesirable answer. How much time do you spend tending to your crops? That's question 4. We have response categories of a lot, some, a little, not very much. These are not perhaps the best response options for a couple of reasons. One is that my definition of a lot might be different from your definition of a lot. So if I spend 10 hours a day tending to my crops, is that a lot or is that a little? So we might want to anchor this in a more concrete set of response options. Also, what we've done here is we've categorized a continuous variable. We've divided a continuous scale and we've divided it into these categories. It might be much better to simply ask, how many hours a day do you spend tending to your crops, and leave judgment about whether that's a lot or a little for some other time. Our last question on this questionnaire, what percentage N does the main type of fertilizer that you use contain? N is nitrogen, but in questionnaires, we don't want to use jargon or abbreviations. We want to phrase our questions so that the people we're talking to, so that we're easily communicating with the people that we're talking to. I think another thing, aside from question phrasing, that I think about in research is we want to make sure research, whether we're reading the research or whether we're conducting the research ourselves, that research measures the right things. There's a key distinction between outputs and outcomes. I will tell you right now that outputs are the easier thing to measure. So they are what more often appears in reports or articles that we might read in academic journals. But outputs are numbers describing the program. So they are things like the number of clients served, the number of services provided, the days that we in this organization provided service, the number of workers that we employed. These are easy numbers to collect, but these measures tell us really very little about client functioning. Outputs are more about system accountability than how people that we are serving, the well-being of people that we are serving. Outcomes are really what we're interested in. These are much harder to design good questions around, but they are the more valuable piece of information to collect. So outcomes are measures like mental health status, the relationship of a parent and a child, neighborhood safety, hunger, income. Really what we want to get at is this core concept of client well-being or participant well-being. That turns out to be the much more valuable thing to measure. I'm going to talk for a moment, and this perhaps gets back to our idea of the philosophical problem of measurement. We have two concepts. We have this idea of reliability, and we have this idea of validity. Reliability is simply the idea that when you are assessing something, when you are asking a question, you're getting consistent answers about the question. So that's a good first criterion of measurement. We want our measures, our questions that we ask in questionnaires, we do want them to be reliable. But we not only want them to be consistent, we also want them to be consistently measuring the right thing, and that's more this question of validity. If we are asking questions about mental health, hoping to measure mental health, are we in fact measuring mental health? So validity is really much more of a theoretical conversation. It's a conversation that we engage in with our research partners, with community members, with people who are being served by our organization or agency. We want to get all of their input. Does the measure or questionnaire actually measure what we want it to measure? And we may have to significantly redesign our questionnaires after talking to all these groups of people. Modern ideas of validity talk about the specific use of the measure or a questionnaire. So not only is the questionnaire appropriate or valid, are the questions appropriate or valid, but are they appropriate or valid in this particular situation? Reliability is a little bit easier to quantify. Again, reliability is this idea of consistency. So we talk about two kinds of reliability that we will talk about here. One is this idea of test, retest reliability, and that's simply the idea that if I administer a questionnaire earlier in the year and I administer a questionnaire not too much later, I hope, for example, if I'm asking questions about mental health, that I'm getting relatively consistent answers. Or I hope if I'm asking questions about community safety, that I'm getting relatively consistent answers. So that's this idea of reliability. Of course, we would expect if we assessed outcomes at some much later time, answers might change, but we hope that if we are asking, questions at two relatively closely spaced points in time, we're getting consistent answers from the people we talk to. Inter-rater reliability is this idea that if I talk to somebody and you talk to somebody, if I conduct an interview and you conduct an interview of the same person, we ought to get relatively equivalent answers. So for example, if people are talking about their mental health or their life satisfaction, if I do the interview and you do the interview, you and I, being two different raters, we ought to get very similar answers. We're going to talk about sampling. This is really the question of, we have participants in studies that we do in social work research. Where do those participants come from? And so one of the things that I think it's important to think about the research literature as a whole, we're talking in more detail about accessing this research literature and some of the other modules, but so much of the research literature comes from what has been called these weird samples. So much of the research comes from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies, and many of the people with whom we're interacting, many of the people that we hope to help, those people might come from other contexts or other situations, and we need to think carefully and critically about whether the research that we're reading applies to those other contexts and situations. We want to think carefully about the representativeness, the generalizability, or the external validity of our study samples. That is to say, the people in our study who've answered questions for us, we want to think about the degree to which those answers are representative or generalizable. That's a synonym or a synonym of that, rather, is external validity. So I'm going to imagine some questions that I might ask people in a study. How satisfied are you with your life? Or a question about how many times in the past week did you feel sad or depressed? And I think it's worth thinking, if I interviewed only clients in the waiting room of an agency, would I get generalizable responses? Probably not. I'm only getting people who have come to the agency, who've been able to come to the agency, who've been able to find time to come and wait in the waiting room. I might start to get more generalizable or more representative answers if I ask clients across my agency or organization. Those are still people who have needed to ask for help potentially, or been able to ask for help. I might be more representative still if I start to ask individuals, residents across my city or my county or my state or my country. So in all of those cases, hopefully we're getting more and more generalizable. The point of all of this, I think, is not to imagine that there is some perfect study that is perfectly generalizable. The point of this is to think about that every study has strengths and limitations. So the people who are part of my research or the research that I'm reading, those people may be more or less representative of people in general. Similarly, so many questions, so many interviews, so many questionnaires are conducted over the phone or using cell phones. We want to think, to what extent does that make a study sample more generalizable, more representative, or less generalizable, less representative? Quite commonly now we do see surveys that are conducted over the web. What does this tell us? What should we think about the representativeness of a study conducted over the web? Perhaps it's only people who have internet access, only people who were reading a particular news story, only people who are energized or motivated about a particular issue. So again, we want to think critically about the representativeness and generalizability of the conclusions that we can draw from any one study. I'm going to talk a little bit, and these are, I suppose, we're moving from less representative, less generalizable, to more representative, more generalizable samples. The easiest kind of study to conduct is what we would call a convenience sample. And this would be, I interview the people who were easily accessible to me. They were accessible to me, for example, perhaps because they were being served by an agency with which I work. That's probably an easy sample to conduct, a less expensive study to carry out, but less representative. We might also think about this idea of the snowball sample. And the snowball sample is, just as the name would suggest, we sometimes use this with difficult to interview populations. For example, if we're interviewing people who are homeless, we might interview a first person. That first person would refer us to a second person, who would refer us to a third person, and so on. And hopefully the sample will snowball into a larger collection of people. Again, if we think carefully about this, this might be a less representative form of data collection. Probably the most representative is when we have a list of individuals across a country or a city or a neighborhood, and then we use some kind of, maybe it's a coin flip, maybe it's the last digit of their cell number. We use some kind of random piece of information to randomly select some of those individuals, and those are the individuals that we approach for an interview to get our sample of information. Let's talk for a moment about effect sizes. Increasingly, we're starting to think, what are the practical effects of the research conclusions that we read? The research literature often focuses on statistical significance, or what gets called the p-value. That's not something that we talk about in great detail in this course, but that's the question of whether or not the results that we see were likely to have been seen by chance, or whether the results that we see in any particular study that we read are so significant that we think it's very unlikely that they were chance results and they're the results of some individual level or some social process at work. There's an emerging impetus, in contrast, to focus on what we call substantive significance, and that's what we're going to talk about here. I think the simplest effect sizes, if you will, to talk about are what we call, or what I call sometimes, these raw effect sizes. So examples like members of the treatment group earned $10 more per year. And the important thing to do here is to make some kind of judgment about, do we think this is a big effect, a meaningful effect, or a small effect, a not so meaningful effect. So if we imagine an intervention or a treatment, 10 weeks of intervention or treatment that is supposed to help members of one group earn more income, we might think that $10 more per year, that really doesn't turn out to be a substantive or meaningful improvement in income for that group. In contrast, we're probably pretty able to interpret $10,000 more per year, and we're also pretty able to judge that that is likely to be a big or a meaningful or a substantively important difference. So with all of these kind of conclusions, this last conclusion here is an example about a mental health intervention. Those who were part of the intervention experienced depression for 10 fewer days a month. It's going to be our own judgment, our own knowledge of the field, our own practice wisdom that is going to tell us whether 10 fewer days a month is a significant improvement in mental health. If you consider that on average there are 30 days in a month or so, 10 fewer days, that certainly sounds like a significant improvement. So we want to think, again, use our own background wisdom, our own judgment about whether effects are meaningful or not. We're going to talk quickly about two more, let us say, statistical forms of effect sizes. And so one of those is the correlation. The correlation is a quantity that varies from 0 to 1 to -1. So a correlation of 0 means that there's really no effect. There's no observable effect between the predictor, in this case, stress, and mental health. A correlation of 1.0 implies that, in fact, there's a perfect relationship between our predictor of stress or mental health. Sometimes we see much smaller correlations, like a correlation of 0.1. It implies that there's some positive relationship between stress and mental health, but that's a weakly positive relationship at best. And lastly, we do sometimes talk about negative or inverse correlations. A correlation here in this example of -0.5, implying that there's a moderate but inverse association between stress and mental health. So that's one kind of more statistically oriented effect size that we're going to often see. We also see people talking in terms of what's called Cohen's d. And very briefly, This is this idea. Here we have a control group and a treatment group, but are the control group and the treatment group, are they different in terms of, are they different if we divide the average scores by the standard deviations of each group? Do the two groups end up being different in terms of standard deviation or standard deviation units? So we see here two groups that are relatively close together. It's very difficult to distinguish the treatment group from the control group. Here we have a slightly larger Cohen's d, and we have a difference that is distinguishable. It appears that here the treatment group is doing much better than the control group. The last idea that we will talk about in this section is this idea of causality versus correlation. You're going to hear people say quite often that correlation is not causation and that we can never talk about causation. We only have correlations. That is in fact not true. Correlation is not necessarily causation, but correlation is certainly sometimes the foundation of causation. There are three criteria. We're going to lay them out on this somewhat abstract diagram and then spell them out in a little bit more detail on the next diagram. So if we think something is a cause of something else, we have to first show that the two things are associated, that when the cause happens, the outcome happens. When one thing goes up, the other thing goes up. In our prior example, for example, when stress goes up, that mental health distress goes up as well. So we have to show association. We also have to show time order, that the thing that caused the other thing, the predictor that caused the outcome, one thing precedes another in time. Lastly, and this is quite a bit more difficult, but we have to think very carefully about whether there might be some alternative explanation. Is there some third factor like socioeconomic status or like neighborhood context or like social context that explains both the cause and the outcome? Let's think about this in a little more detail with this idea of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that are increasingly emerging in the research literature. So adverse childhood experiences we've discussed elsewhere in the course. Adverse childhood experiences are things like experiencing neglect or abuse as a child, having a parent who's incarcerated, having a parent who has mental health difficulties, not having enough food in the house. And if we want to read a literature or help be part of a literature, read evidence, or be part of creating evidence that adverse childhood experiences are a cause of behavior problems and mental health difficulties down the road, we have to establish a number of things. First, we have to establish that in people where we see higher levels of adverse childhood experiences, we see higher levels of behavior problems or mental health issues. Second, we have to be able to establish that adverse childhood experiences came before those behavior problems or mental health difficulties in time. And lastly, we have to be able to rule out, all those background factors. Here, for example, we have to be able to rule out poverty probably is associated with adverse childhood experiences. Poverty is associated with later behavior problems or mental health difficulties. We want to carefully look and make sure that we can rule out poverty as a common cause of both of those factors. To sum up, correlation is not causation. Certainly that's true. Correlation does not necessarily imply causation. However, correlation can be a foundation of causation, and when properly applied, correlation can help us make causal conclusions about the things that we care about.